Nothing aggressive had happened yet. No yelling, no threats, no weapon drawn. The driver's hands were still sitting flat on top of the steering wheel when the Texas officer suddenly reached for the door handle. And in less than 90 seconds, a completely routine traffic stop turned into an $11.9 million federal case. Because what most drivers never realize is this: a traffic stop does not become dangerous the moment an officer raises his voice. Sometimes it becomes dangerous much earlier than that. Sometimes the line gets crossed quietly, subtly, in ways most innocent people don't even recognize while it's happening. And by the time they finally realize something feels wrong, the entire stop has already changed. That is exactly what happened here. The driver thought he was cooperating. The officer believed he had control. And somewhere in the middle of that interaction, constitutional boundaries started collapsing in real time. Tonight, we're breaking down the Texas traffic stop that exploded into one of the largest police misconduct payouts in recent memory, why the federal case became such a massive legal disaster, and the exact moment the stop crossed a line every driver in America needs to understand before their next encounter with law enforcement. Because this case was never just about one officer. It exposed something much bigger. The uncomfortable reality that many innocent drivers unknowingly make the situation worse, specifically because they are trying to appear cooperative. And that psychological trap is where a lot of these encounters begin spiraling. Before we go further, subscribe right now if you follow Supreme Court decisions, police encounter cases, and constitutional rights stories like this. This channel breaks down the moments most people completely miss until it happens to somebody on the side of a road with flashing lights behind them. Now, here's how this entire thing started. It was late, dark, quiet. One of those Texas highways where the road almost disappears into blackness outside your windshield. The driver wasn't fleeing, wasn't speeding excessively, wasn't acting aggressive. By all appearances, this should have been an ordinary stop. The officer approaches the vehicle. Flashlight hits the mirror, then the dashboard, then the driver's hands. Standard stuff. And at first, everything actually looks calm. The driver answers questions, keeps his voice level, tries to be respectful, which is exactly what most innocent people do. That's important to understand, because innocent people usually believe cooperation automatically creates safety. They think, if I stay polite, if I explain myself, if I show I'm not a threat, this will end faster. But former officers and defense attorneys have talked about this for years. Under stress, innocent people often start over-cooperating, talking too much, moving too quickly, answering questions nobody legally required them to answer. Not because they're guilty, because adrenaline changes human behavior fast. And you can actually see that pressure building during stops like this. Breathing changes, speech speeds up, hands start moving more. People try filling silence because silence feels uncomfortable. But silence inside a traffic stop affects officers differently than it affects civilians. To an officer, nervous movement can start looking unpredictable. And unpredictable is what changes the energy of a stop. That's exactly where this one started turning. At some point during the interaction, the officer begins pushing beyond the original reason for the stop. More questions, longer pauses, fishing for inconsistencies. And this is where many drivers completely miss what's happening legally, because the stop still feels normal. There's no screaming yet, no physical confrontation, no obvious explosion. But legally, the encounter is already drifting into dangerous territory. Courts have repeatedly discussed this issue. An officer can absolutely control a scene for safety reasons during a lawful stop. But the Constitution still places limits on how long a driver can be detained, what justifies escalation, and when an officer can expand the stop beyond its original purpose. That's the invisible line most people never see. And once that line gets crossed, everything afterward becomes complicated. The officer in this case eventually escalated the interaction physically. Commands became sharper. The tone changed. The atmosphere inside the stop shifted immediately. You can almost feel it happen. 1 second, it's a traffic violation. The next second, every movement inside the vehicle suddenly feels loaded with tension. And here's the scary part. A lot of innocent drivers instinctively react the wrong way the moment that pressure spikes. Not because they're dangerous, because human beings under authority stress often panic in subtle ways. They start explaining harder, talking faster, moving more. Sometimes they even try physically complying before instructions are fully clear, which can make officers more tense instead of less. That psychological spiral is one of the biggest hidden factors in modern traffic stop escalations. And according to the federal lawsuit that followed, that spiral is exactly what the jury believed this officer mishandled. Because at a certain point, the stop stopped looking like officer safety and started looking like constitutional overreach. That distinction matters enormously. A federal civil rights case is not simply about whether an officer made a mistake. The question becomes, did the officer violate clearly established constitutional protections? That is a much bigger problem. And once body cam footage enters the courtroom, everything slows down. Every command, every pause, every movement, every tone shift. Jurors don't experience the stop emotionally the way officers do in real time. They experience it frame by frame. That changes everything. What feels tense in the moment can suddenly look excessive later under courtroom scrutiny. And according to the allegations in this case, that's exactly what happened. The driver argued the officer unnecessarily escalated the stop, crossed legal boundaries, and violated his constitutional rights during the encounter. The lawsuit exploded. Experts weighed in. Civil rights attorneys dissected the footage. Former officers debated tactics. Legal analysts started focusing on whether the escalation was actually justified under the Fourth Amendment. And eventually, the case turned into an $11.9 million disaster. Think about that number for a second. $11.9 million. Cases do not reach numbers like that because somebody got mildly annoyed during a traffic ticket. Jurors usually reserve outcomes like that for situations where they believe something went seriously wrong. And the reason this case hit so hard nationally is because millions of drivers watched parts of themselves inside that interaction. Not criminals, ordinary people. People trying to stay calm, trying to cooperate, trying to avoid making things worse. That's why these stories spread so fast online now. Because viewers don't watch and think, that could never happen to me. They watch and think, I probably would have reacted exactly the same way. And honestly, that's what makes these encounters psychologically terrifying. Most people are completely unprepared for the pressure of a roadside stop once the tone changes unexpectedly. The average driver has never trained for that kind of stress. Officers deal with traffic stops constantly. Drivers don't, which means officers usually control the emotional pace of the encounter from the very beginning. And when that control shifts toward escalation, many civilians mentally spiral fast. That's why legal experts constantly warn against one specific mistake innocent drivers make during stressful encounters. They start trying to talk their way back to safety. Huge mistake. Because once an officer has already shifted into enforcement mode, extra talking often creates extra problems. More statements, more inconsistencies, more nervous behavior, more opportunities for misunderstanding. Silence feels unnatural under pressure, but strategically, silence is often safer than panic-driven conversation. That does not mean becoming aggressive. It does not mean refusing lawful orders. It means understanding something most people never think about. You are not required to emotionally perform innocence on the side of a highway. And cases like this are exactly why. Now, obviously, every traffic stop is different. Not every officer behaves improperly. Not every escalation is unlawful, and officers absolutely deal with dangerous situations every day. That nuance matters, but constitutional boundaries matter too, and federal juries take those boundaries seriously when they believe they've been crossed. Especially when body cam footage creates a clear timeline of escalation. That's one reason these massive police misconduct payouts keep attracting national attention, because they force uncomfortable conversations about where officer authority ends and where constitutional protections begin. And for ordinary drivers, those lines matter more than most people realize, especially during the first few minutes of a stop, because legally, the earliest moments are often the most important. Not the yelling later, not the arrest afterward, the beginning, the initial detention, the questioning, the justification for escalation. That's where entire federal cases are built. Which brings us to the biggest lesson from this Texas case. Most innocent drivers think danger starts when physical force appears. But many civil rights attorneys would tell you the real danger usually begins much earlier, right around the moment the stop quietly transforms from investigation into control. And most people never recognize that transition while it's happening. That's why understanding roadside psychology matters now more than ever. Not to beat cops, not to become confrontational, but because emotional panic changes behavior, and behavior changes outcomes, especially under flashing lights at night with adrenaline flooding your system. So what should drivers actually take away from a case like this? First, slow everything down. Your movements, your speech, your breathing. Fast nervous energy escalates encounters. Second, do not confuse over-explaining with safety. Most drivers think more talking helps. Often it doesn't. Third, understand that politeness and constitutional protections can exist together. You can comply with lawful instructions while still protecting your legal position calmly. And finally, recognize how quickly normal traffic stops can emotionally shift. Because once panic takes over, people stop thinking clearly. And when human beings stop thinking clearly under pressure, small moments become life-changing ones. That's part of why this Texas case hit such a nerve across the country. Not because viewers saw a monster, not because they saw a movie-style villain, but because they saw a situation that escalated in a way that felt disturbingly real, messy, fast, human. And somewhere inside that roadside tension, a line was crossed that ended in an $11.9 million federal reckoning, which is exactly why every driver needs to understand this before their next stop. Because constitutional rights matter most, in the moments ordinary people feel the least emotionally prepared to protect them.